Okay, so what I'd like to do is do a little bit of a review, and this will allow us to take a look at the brain. And last week, what we were doing was talking about the different parts of the brain. So when we take a look at the brain, we're going to have different lobes. We'll have a frontal lobe, this area here, which extends up to this portion up above. You'll have a parietal, which is on top, occipital, which will be in the back, and temporal, that would be on the side. And so each of these different regions have a different function. So if we look at the primary motor is in the frontal. And so this area will have control over skeletal muscle. Somatosensory will be in the parietal, and that's this area right here. Later, you'll hear a little bit about one of the cranial nerves that deal with speech. And as I admit some of my students to the class, what I've started doing is doing a little bit of review over the brain, and I'm doing that right now. Can you hear me? If so, give me a thumbs up. Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about, basically we're going to be talking a little bit about cranial nerves, and we're going to look at different parts of the brain. And so what I wanted to do was review different parts, and this will be on the tape version. So in other words, when we look at this, we're going to have a frontal lobe, and we're going to have a prefrontal lobe. We're going to have a temporal lobe on the side for hearing, and occiput will be in the back. Okay. When we look inside, there were certain regions that that each had a function. So let's say the medulla. When we're looking in here, we were saying that the medulla is this area where it's a little bit oblong, so it's called medulla oblongata, and that was for respiration. This area is pons, and it's also for respiration. We're going to find an area where we have a pituitary gland, and that gland is going to control metabolism. It'll have an effect on sexual activity. It will also have an effect on growth. And so this is controlled what's called the hypothalamus. And so this is the hypothalamus just above this pituitary gland. Above this is the thalamus, and if we look in our notes, that's a relay area for all information, crude information going up to the cortex. So that would be this area right in here. We're also going to have in the back the cerebellum, and if we look in the cerebellum, there'll be what's called the arbor vitae, which are white matter tracts that connect both parts of the cerebellum. Okay. Some other information we want to talk about. There are some tracts well developed in women called corpus callosum, and it will allow each hemisphere to work with the other side. So the corpus callosum is this area here. There's also what would be ventricles. Ventricles are areas where cerebral spinal fluid is going to be produced. Okay, so it's not yet 7 o'clock, but what I wanted to do is let's take a look at some of the, like of the brain, let's take a look at some of the different lobes and what their function is. So in other words, we said that the motor cortex was in the what? In the frontal part, okay? We also said that the sensory cortex was in the parietal aspect. So later tonight, we're going to look at cranial nerves, and we're going to let me go ahead and get, there we are. So we're going to be looking at the cranial nerves, and we need to know, well, what part of the brain is, involved. So in other words, hearing is going to be a temporal lobe, just like occipital is for what? Vision, okay? Intellect, we said, was in the prefrontal cortex. And so anything that deals with some kind of motor control or a muscle allows me to talk or speak it has to interact with the cortex that's the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is going to be in this frontal lobe. And then the parietal lobe is going to be a sensory. So if we have a sensation or a nerve, that's a cranial nerve, and it has some sensation, it has to also go to the sensory cortex. So I thought we should take a little look at that. Is it 7 o'clock yet, anybody? Is it pretty close? All right, so what I wanted to do is the information that they have is very, very technical. And I think the best way to kind of handle it is to, having used these 3 sheets that have all the information on it, let's fill in the sheets that we have that you're supposed to know by the time we get done with live, okay? And so basically, this is talking about the spinal cord is what it is. So they want to know what is the epidural space and what is the dura mater. And so what I have in front of us is an example of the spinal cord itself. So if everybody can, so what we have here actually is, this is the spinal cord in this area right in through here, okay? And so let's go back to last week when I had this board, which was the reflex board. Remember we were talking about, we said last week that we had a sensory receptor, a sensory nerve, we had a sensory neuron, then we have, so everything going into the cell body is dendrite. Anything after it is what? Axon, okay? And so then we have an association neuron, which would be here. And the association is between the sensory and the motor. And then on this side, we have a motor nucleus and then the axon. You've seen this when we were talking about the neuromuscular junction, when we talked about muscles, okay? So what I want to do right now is I'm going to take my mouse pad and I'm going to put it over a part of this board. And so going into the spinal cord is this sensory information. This is the nucleus, and it'll become part of what's called the dorsal root ganglion. It's not in the spinal cord. What I'm blocking is what's in the spinal cord. And so what is coming out of the spinal cord? A motor what? Axon going to an effector. So on this board, it's showing you the 5 different parts of a reflex arc. And so when I'm looking at this, we're going to kind of get an idea of actually what's going on. So let's get orientated. This is when we're looking at it here, this would be a cervical vertebra. This is posterior. This is the back. So this here is the back of like my neck. This is the vertebral body. And so now I've got this spinal cord. It looks like a butterfly. Does everybody kind of see that? Going into this, there's a swelling called the dorsal root ganglion. That's where the neurons, the sensory neurons are located. And then after that, I'm going to have these little sensory roots. There are these little yellow, let's say, nerves going in, and that's going into what's called the dorsal horn. So on the dorsal, or the backside, is the dorsal horn. And then in the bottom, we have the anterior or ventral horn. Between the dorsal horn and this ventral horn is the interneuron or association neuron. So that's where it'll be located. And then, as I was saying on that board, what will be coming out is a motor rootlet. So these little yellow strings coming out, that's the motor axon. So when you look at the nerve that's out here, it's actually a nerve that's a mixed nerve. It has sensory information going into the spinal cord and motor information coming out of the spinal cord. Does that make any sense? So let's go over all these different structures. So for tonight's assignment, we need to know what they all do. So if you look on page 1, it says epidural space. And epidural space is D. That's the area where there's fat outside of the nerve or outside the spinal cord. It's a cushion. And so outside, if we do an epidural, let's say if you're an MD or DO and you're doing an epidural, you're going to stick what? Cortisol or cortisone just on the outside of the nerve. Okay? Trying to do what? Trying to get rid of inflammation is what you're trying to do. So the epidural space is outside the dura. And we have what are called meninges. Meninges are layers around the nerve. And the outer part is called the dura. It's the heavy, thick part. So when I'm looking at this structure here, we're going to actually have the dura as this outermost layer. It's the outermost layer. Dura, D-U-R-A. Just underneath it is called the arachnoid. The arachnoid layer is named after a spider. And you go, well, how did that happen? Well, there's a space in this called the subarachnoid space, and it looks just like cobweb. So it got its name arachnoid. And so in the subarachnoid space will be located cerebral spinal fluid, and that's the fluid that surrounds your spinal cord that's made in your ventricles, okay? And so around the entire spinal cord, you're going to have fluid. Remember, it gives nourishment and it helps to do what? With shock absorption, okay? It gets rid of gases and it'll bring gases to it. So the intimate layer on the spinal cord is called the pia mater, M-A-T-E-R. So when we look at our sheet for tonight, we have epidural space is D. That's the area with fat. That's a cushion. Then you have the dura, the outer heavy, and that's G, outermost protective layer. And what did I say was underneath it? Arachnoid. Arachnoid is right under the under the dura, and that's F, middle protective layer. Then there's a space. That space is called subarachnoid space. So I can actually take like my pen or pencil and stick it into this space in here. And that's where fluid has to be able to circulate. So that's the subarachnoid space. And then that was H. And then pia is E, the innermost protective layer. In the middle of the spinal cord, right here, is called the central canal. Central canal is between each part. It'll be right in the center. And it's a little tiny area where fluid will actually go through the middle of the spine, okay? And then on the anterior aspect, and central canal is N. There's a, basically there's like a little anterior fissure. So how do I know which is dorsal? How do I know which is ventral or anterior? There's a little cleft here. It's called the anterior fissure. On the slides, if you're looking at a slide, you would need to find where this dorsal root ganglion is because it's always on the dorsal side. So that lets me get orientated that dorsal is this way and ventral is this way. Does everybody kind of make sense? So in other words, they might want to say, well, which horn is it? Is it a dorsal horn? Is it a ventral horn or anterior horn? I haven't made any of these questions yet. So maybe you could come up with some good questions that I should use on the test when I get ready to start, putting the questions together. All right. So the dorsal root ganglion is C. It has sensory neurons and it's outside of the spinal cord itself. And then the little sensory rootlets are going to go into the dorsal horn. So it says dorsal root ganglion is C, contains sensory neuron cell bodies. And then the posterior horn is I, contains association neuron cell bodies. And then the ventral horn is J, motor neuron cell bodies. And we're going to go over this looking at that board. And then it has tracks. Tracks are groups of nerves sending information. It's kind of like trains going or elevators in a building. You know, they're going up and they're going down. So we have tracks taking information from the skin and inside the body, let's say up to the brain. That's an ascending track. And then any information that's going from the brain down is a descending track. So an ascending track would be A, myelin fibers carrying sensory information to the brain. And then the myelin axons carrying motor impulses from the brain would be in the descending, that'd be B. And the last one, cerebral spinal fluid, should be M. It's nutrients and gases are transported to the nerve through the cerebral spinal fluid. All right, let's look for all of that on here. And you go, all right, so what are we going to see? On this board, all we're going to see, if we're around the spinal cord, the cord itself, is going to be this area right in here, because the sensory nerve is going towards the spinal cord. This, it would be the dorsal ganglion. This is the cell groups of sensory cell bodies. This is what? If this is a dendrite going in, that has to be a what? It's going away, an axon, correct? All right. So this is an association neuron. Association neuron. These cell bodies are in the dorsal horn, and then the let's say the nucleus of the motor neuron is in the ventral horn. And then what leaves the spinal cord? Well, a motor neuron axon is leaving, going to an effector. Okay, does everybody kind of follow where this is coming from? So it'll kind of give you an idea, information going in, information coming out. While I have this board, and I always like to ask this, what are the 5 parts of a reflex arc? It's in our notes. Sensory receptor is here. Sensory nerve is here. And this happens to be a unipolar neuron, correct? We talked about it last time. This is an interneuron here, or what is called an association neuron. A motor neuron that is here, and this is going, the motor neuron is taking information along the axon to the effector. So I have a sensory receptor, I have a sensory neuron, I have an association neuron, I have a motor neuron, and what is this? The effector, which could be a muscle or a gland, okay? So those are the 5 parts of the reflex arc. Does that make any sense? Does it make it a little easier to see it? All right, so that gets us through page 1 and gives you some information about the spinal cord itself. There will be pictures, I looked at them, and they're going to show you everything that we were looking at. So the swelling that is here, that's outside, there's swelling here, it's this real thick part here, that's the dorsal root ganglion, right in there. And it's going in to this area here, so that would be the dorsal horn. The central canal is right in the middle where this isthmus is. And how do I know? There's a fissure, a crack, right here on the anterior part. So that tells me that that's ventral, this crack here. So above it's dorsal horn, ventral horn. So sensory information, we have little yellow, like, I don't know if you can see them, there are little yellow strings going in. They represent the nerves going in. That's the sensory nerve going in. And then coming out are these little, you can probably see them now, there are these yellow strings. Those are the motor neurons coming out. They're called rootlets, is what they actually are, okay, that we have right there. So you'll be able to get a better picture, but this gives you an idea. So when you look at it, the white tracks, ascending or descending, it's the myelin, okay, is what we have. So these are where tracks are located, where the white area is. And the dark part, that's where the horns are. And we have a dorsal horn, a ventral horn. And what's this? There's a lateral horn. Has anyone read about the lateral horn? Well, you normally hear about dorsal ventral, but in the thoracic spine, there's so many different things going on. There's also a lateral horn. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at the next part. The next sheet that you have is page 2, and it happens to be cranial nerves. So there's 12 cranial nerves. And I was wondering, well, gee, how are we going to talk about that? And I go, well, probably the easiest thing that you can do is pull out your sheet, if you don't mind, or later on, you can look at this sheet with these 12 cranial nerves. But what's the most prominent part of my face? What's the first thing, if I'm going towards my face, that I'm going to hit? What am I going to hit first? Leah, what am I going to hit? Octavio, I'm going to get close to your face. What am I going to hit first? What is the first part that I'm going to run into if I'm coming towards
your nose?
My nose. So what do you think the first cranial nerve is going to be? First cranial nerve is my nose. What's the second thing I'm going to hit as I'm coming towards my face? My eye. So the first cranial nerve is olfaction, my nose. Second is what? Optic. Gee, this is hard stuff, guys. Okay? All right, I'm just kidding with you. I've only done this thousands of times. All right. So when you look on the ventral part of the brain, so here's our, that's the inside of the brain, okay? That's the outside part. But how do I find these cranial nerves? I got to do what? I got to look underneath. I got to look underneath like that. And so what am I going to actually see? This long first cranial nerve is right there. So we'll ask what nerve is this? So on your in your vision, or in your let's say pictures, it has olfactory, it has optic, and then there's 3, 4, and 6. We'll talk about them right now. So if the first cranial nerve is smell and the second is for vision, what are the motor functions for the first or second cranial nerve? There are none. So they're purely sensory. That nerve is purely sensory. So if I wanted to know what brain structure, I think what we need to do is, I'll just give you like a letter. So if it's the temporal part, it should be T. Okay, that's for olfaction. And if it's the part of the brain where we have vision, that's O for what? Occipital. Okay. And if it's frontal, it should be F. And if it's P, it should be parietal. Does everybody get the idea? So you can just write them in, and then later on in your notes, you can put in more information. All right. I have to move my eyeballs, do I not? I got to move them up and down and left and right. And so cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, they move the eyeball. So let's group them that way. So when we look at what they do, under its motor function for number 3, in their Roman numeral, it's eyeball movement. For 3, for trochlear, eyeball movement, okay, under motor. And for abducens, it's eyeball movement. So the motor function is to move your eye, all right? Now there's something called proprioception, and I want you to look it up, because I've looked it up at least 5 or 6 times, and proprioception allows me to have some understanding as to where I am in space. But you need to read what proprioception is. But proprioception is a sensory ability to know where we are. And so cranial nerves 3, cranial nerve 4, put P for proprioception, because notice on the bottom they have all these different things. You're supposed to fill the blanks in. So cranial nerve 3 and 4 and 6 are all proprioception under sensory. And while we're talking about it, it says there should be 5 of them, go all the way down to the bottom 2 under sensory. It'll say accessory, put P, proprioception there, and hypoglossal proprioception. It gives us an orientation is what it does. All right. So if I move my eyeball, am I using sensation, or am I going to need to coordinate that with some muscle functional part of my brain? I mean, it's a muscle. So where would I have to go to, what part of the brain should control my eyeball movement? How about we go to the motor cortex? Where's the motor cortex? Remember we said motor cortex was in the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is the motor cortex, and we said M is before S in the alphabet. So there's S, there's the sensory cortex that's in the parietal. So when we start looking at what's the brain structure for cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, I got to go to the motor cortex because they move my eyeball. They're all little tiny muscles. Does everybody follow? All right, let me grab an eye. I brought an eye today. Be right back. Aren't you lucky I brought an eyeball? I only borrowed it for 2 weeks though. All right, so this is an eyeball that's got an iris that moves around. But these muscles that are oculomotor controls part of them, there's one of them is called the trochlear. So in other words, cranial nerve, what is that? 1V, that's number 4. The trochlea is a pulley, and so there's a muscle that goes to this. You can't really tell, but anyway, if this is the right eye, there's going to be a little pulley up over here, and it'll go in, and it will kind of pull the eye a certain way. And so that's how it got its name, because it's got a little pulley. So when we look at the trochlear, that's number 4, but this one is kind of easy. This is the lateral rectus muscle. Okay, if this is my right eye, lateral rectus muscle. If I go and don't go to the midline, if I go to midline, I've adducted, have I not? ADDUCT, remember? What if I go lateral? I'm going to go to the outside. I've done what? ABDUCTED. So what is the name for the 6th cranial nerve that has an effect on that muscle? Abducens, because it abducts the eye. So if you know a little bit about some of these cranial nerves, it's not as bad. So cranial nerve 6, which is V1, takes your eyeball that way. Okay, takes it lateral. It's called abducens. Now the one called the trochlea, it goes through a little pulley and it pulls the eyeball down and out. And so that's the trochlear nerve. And then the muscles that are on top of the eye, this is the superior rectus. If I have a superior rectus, what do I have to have? An inferior rectus down below. Does everybody see? So inferior would be down below. This would be medial. This would be lateral. And so we'll be getting into that more next week. So let's go back and look at cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. Cranial nerves 3, under sensory, it's P for proprioception. Under motor function, it's an eyeball movement, and it goes to the frontal cortex, the motor cortex. Same with trochlea. Okay, proprioception, P for the sensory, and for the motor function, eyeball movement. What brain structure? The frontal, okay? Frontal lobe and the motor cortex. Okay, now I'm at cranial nerve what? 5. Cranial nerve 5 is called trigeminal, and it's got 3 parts to it. So Octavia, we're going to use you right now, okay? I hope you're not too mad, but you did something and your girlfriend slapped you in the face. She hit you hard, and you got a red mark above the eye, right here, and right down below. So what we're going to have is ophthalmic is the first branch. What is that? Maxillary is the second, and mandibular is the third. So those are the three regions. And how did you realize you got slapped in the face? You felt it, right? So trigeminal, it's on each side. So it's a nerve for facial sensation. So under sensory, cranial nerve 5 is called trigeminal, and it's got three parts. It's got olfactory for above the eye, the what's here, maxillary, and the mandibular. And the only way you know that you got hit in the face is you can feel it. So when we look at trigeminal, the sensory function is facial skin sensation. Okay, so Octavio, when you got slapped in the side of the face, you felt it. That's a sensation. And there's three parts of it, trigeminal. All right, trigeminal has a motor function, and that's to chew. That's the motor, so it allows you to chew. Some of these nerves, cranial nerves, will do more than one thing, and its motor function is to chew. So what part of the brain am I going to, let's say, work with in order to control, let's say, this function? For sensation, am I going to go to the motor cortex? No, I'm going to go to the parietal cortex where I have my sensory cortex. So the parietal sensory cortex would be the brain structure for that nerve, trigeminal. And for chewing, I'm chewing, right? I'm using muscles. So what part of my brain do I go to? I'm going to go to the frontal motor cortex for that. So those are the two parts of your brain that allow me to deal with the trigeminal nerve. Now it's sensory for what? Facial sensation, and it's motor chewing, so that you can chew. Does everybody follow? All right, so we've already talked about 6. 6 was abducens, allows me to abduct my eye. So my eye can go that way, or my left eye can go that way. I've abducted. And so remember, it's proprioception, P, for sensory, and eyeball movement. So when I move the eyeball, it's the frontal motor cortex. All right, now we're at facial, which is the 7th cranial nerve. I have sensory already taken care of because Octavio got slapped in the face. But how do I smile? How do I move these muscles? I got to have something that controls that. So when we look at facial, it's facial expression. That's how it got its name. So under motor control, the 7th cranial nerve is facial muscles, allows your zygomaticus to contract. Does everybody kind of follow? So the facial nerve is the motor nerve that allows you to smile. And so what is its sensory portion? Well, it allows you to taste. So it's going to allow you to taste as well. So sensory for facial is taste, okay? And the motor part is to smile. That's a motor function. So taste is gustatory. That means taste, and it's parietal lobe, P, parietal lobe. And because I'm dealing with muscle, I have to go to the frontal cortex to what? My motor cortex, okay, is where I need to go for facial. Does that make sense? Everybody with me so far? Okay. All right. The next one, the 8th cranial nerve, is 2 nerves coming together, vestibulo and cochlea. The vestibule allows me to have some orientation in space and give me equilibrium. Cochlea allows me to hear. So when we look at vestibular cochlea, the sensory is hearing and equilibrium. There's minimal motor. So where do I hear? Remember, the temporal was the auditory part, so the temporal lobe. And if we're talking about equilibrium, trying to keep my balance, I need to use my motor cortex in the frontal lobe, but what else in the cerebellum? I need to use my cerebellum too. So your cerebellum gives you equilibrium. So those are the parts that are important for the vestibulocochlear. So vestibule is balance, equilibrium. and it's dealing with auditory is temporal, but it's going to the motor cortex and it's going to the cerebellum. Any fine movement needs the cerebellum. Does everybody understand? So if I need to do something in work like play a piano, catch a baseball, shoot a basketball, I need to get my cerebellum because it's fine movements. I'm doing fine movements is what we're doing. All right. After that one, we have the ninth cranial nerve is called glossopharyngeal. Glossus means tongue. Write that down. Glossus means tongue. Pharynx is here, my pharynx. Okay. And so glossopharyngeal is taste, under sensory, and blood gases. So I need to be able to have some understanding of what my oxygen levels are. But put your hand on your throat and swallow. All right. Swallowing and speech is using the pharynx, and glossus means tongue. So that's the motor function, swallowing and speech. And all this stuff is in these notes. And so what part of the brain will I use? I'll use the gustatory for taste, and the gustatory is in parietal. And then I'm going to use the medulla. Medulla is blood pressure gases. And then when I speak, there's a part of the brain. Remember, there was a part of the brain called Broca's speech area. Broca is this little area here. And it does what? It allows me to move my lips and my mouth. Okay, so Broca is needed for swallowing and speech. So let me see what else I've got in there. In order to do the blood pressure and blood gases, I need to use the medulla as well, medulla oblongata. That'll be in there. Okay. All right, we're getting to number 10. I like number 10. Right, wanderer. Moses wandered how many years? 40 years trying, through the desert, right? So the vagus is the wanderer. And so it wanders from up in the brain down into my chest, and it has an effect on my heart, and it wanders all the way into my digestive system, and it goes to my gut. So when we think of this wanderer, the vagus nerve is also for taste, and it's for blood pressure and blood gases as well. But it's going to my heart and my digestive tract. And so when we look on your sheet, all this stuff is coming right from your sheet. All I did is just take it off there and I wrote it in. And that's one way of learning it. So you got to write it down. So when it says vagus, mixed nerve for the pharynx, larynx, heart, lungs, digestive. Sensory, taste, blood gases. Motor, innervates, it affects my heart rate. It has an effect on this smooth muscle in my digestive tract called the vagus nerve. And so let's say the vagus, when we're looking at it, basically it's going to be taste is gustatory parietal, and then a lot of it is in the medulla for the vagus. All right, we're getting close. There's only 2 left. I'm going to put my shoulders up like this. Why am I doing that? Because I'm tired? No, because the next cranial nerve is called, you learned it as accessory. It allows me under motor function to bring my traps up like this. And so it allows me to move my head. And so I learned it as spinal accessory. So head and shoulder movement under motor is spinal accessory. And we already said its sensory part was proprioception. And because it's motor, moving my muscles, I'm going to the frontal what? Cortex. And then the last one is called hypoglossal. It allows me to swallow and to speak. And in order to swallow or speak, I need motor. And the motor is again in the frontal cortex. And every time I use my ability to speak. I got to go to what part of the brain? I forgot, began with a B. BROCA stands for Broca. So there's an area called the Broca for speech. Okay. The only way to get these down is to put them together. So in other words, I would say name 2 cranial nerves that are purely sensory. And I'd say, well, 1 and 2. Name the 3 cranial nerves that move your eyeball, Octavio. 3, 4, and 6. Name the cranial nerves that are responsible for taste. 7, 9, and 10. And the only way you're going to learn them is to group them together and get some kind of understanding. Name the cranial nerve that allows me to feel on my face. Okay, but you know this because I slapped you in the face, or your girlfriend did rather. She slapped you and you felt it. So that was trigeminal. Which cranial nerve allows you to have facial expression, be happy? Well, 7th cranial nerve, facial nerve. So in other words, vagus is the wanderer. It goes to my heart and my digestive tract. So which allows me to move my tongue, glossopharyngeal and hypoglossal. And so you'll kind of get them down, but you want to play with it. So that's the kind of, I may have questions like that, but in your notes, I think, or in your sheet, it has like a review for you guys as well. I think it was the 5th one, or page 4. So it'll ask you, and then I'm not going to do this with you. Okay, if somebody can turn off their, thank you. Please turn off mute your mic, please. Thank you. All right, so if you want to test your knowledge, then what you want to go ahead and do is check these out and go back. And the way you want to do that is look at the sheet that you have, and that'll kind of help you. This one does this one, and this does that. Okay, so that'll help a little bit on that. All right, let's see what else we want to talk about. All right, we already talked about a reflex arc, right? So let's go to page 3. Page 3 asks the 5-part of the reflex arc. So which carries impulses from the central nervous system out to the effector? That would be the motor neuron. And then which carries impulses from the receptor to the nervous system? That would be the what? Sensory neuron. And then it wants to know which integrates or processes information with the spinal cord. That's the association neuron. And then the gland or muscle that is going to be controlled is the effector. It's being affected. And so that's the effector. And then how do I detect the stimulus? With a sensory receptor. Okay, so that it goes motor, sensory, association neuron, effector, and receptor. All right, so when we start looking at it, there's a list here on the bottom, and they go examples of effectors. Skeletal muscle. I can move my arm. I control my arm. So a basically a somatoreflex is something I control. Like I can control skeletal muscle. So that's a somatic example of an effector. Can I control my heart or glands or peristalsis? No. So that's autonomic. I have no control over that. I can try and, if I put food in my stomach, it's going to work all its way through the digestive tract. I can't stop it. So there's an example of reflexes, and they want you to tell them if it's autonomic, if you do not have any control over it, or if you have control over it. And if I have control, it's a somatic reflex. And if I don't have any, it's autonomic. So peristaltic, just use the letter A. It's an autonomic. A flexor reflex, like I put my hand on a hot oven, I pull it off. Or if I touch something sharp, I'm going to pull it off. That's a flexor what? Reflex. It's not I have control of that. I mean, it's a reflex, but it's a what? It's a somatic. So everybody, you see where I'm coming from? Blood pressure, my blood pressure. Can I control my blood pressure? Maybe some people in India, a Swami could, but I can't. So it's autonomic. Does everybody follow? If I listen to the right kind of music, I can get it to go down, but I can't control it. All right. What about a stretched tendon reflex? That's a somatic. What about my respiration? Can I control that? That's an autonomic. That's through remember the pons and the medulla oblongata control respiration. What about this crossed extensor? Keeping, like I tripped, trying to keep your balance. That's an S, somatosensory. Okay, what about my heart rate? Can I control my heart rate? Nope, autonomic. What about my knee jerk with the patella knee jerk? Somatic, somatosensory. What about my pupillary? Like if I shine a light in Leah's eyes to see, and they either get smaller or larger, that's the what? Autonomic. And then if I do a Babinski is you take a piece of metal, like a hammer, reflex hammer, and you stroke the bottom of the foot. That's a somatic reflex is what we have. So tonight's lab basically is giving you a lot of information about different parts of the nervous system. Does everybody have some understanding of the brain? I know we didn't really get into that last time I talked about it, and we didn't have a photo or any pictures. Does everybody kind of have some idea about the corpus callosum and how it connects both sides of the brain, and that your prefrontal cortex is intelligence, intellect, ability to think, intuition, and creativity? There's an area here, smell. Basically, in here, I wanted to check this just to make sure that I have it right. So when we're talking about smell, that's going to be in the temporal. So if you look over here, temporal, it says it on the side. I just wanted to double check. And in the back, we have vision. Okay. And so let's look on this side. There's a prefrontal motor area, by the way. But when we think of motor, it's just before the gyrus here. So this is the motor cortex. And then I have a central gyrus, and then I'm in the parietal. And this is sensory. And let's say hearing is temporal. Remember we said your ears are right up by the temporal lobe. Okay. All right. I looked to see how you guys are doing on the quizzes, and it seems like you're getting a lot of the information down. I see a lot of 90s and 100s. So that's a good thing. Do we have any questions so far? I uploaded, last week, I uploaded a completed lab on this so you could go and check it out. Does anybody ever check those out to make sure that the information you have is correct? I hope you do.
I check it out every once in a while.
Okay, good. It's there to help you guys. Okay, so how would I learn this stuff? They'll obviously, what we could do for like on your quiz, they can have a picture of the heart, and they'll say, what cranial nerve controls this organ? And well, obviously the vagus nerve. Okay, remember the wanderer. And it'll say facial expressions, or it'll show somebody smiling, and they'll want to know what cranial nerve allows you to smile. Well, facial expression is 7. And then it'll say, what, like if you kiss your girlfriend, Octavio, how do you know you kissed your girlfriend? 5th cranial nerve, man. Okay, it's sensory. All right, so right in here, and so we got the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Sensation is 5th cranial nerve. Does everybody kind of get me? What about if I move my arms up, or my shoulders up like that? Spinal accessory, And so you kind of play with it a little bit is what we'll actually do. Okay. any other ideas or questions that you have? Did anybody go look at the video that I did in the Tuesday night last week? Did anybody check it out? Nobody? Okay. I think it's nice to see a picture. You know, sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. All right, so if there's not any other questions, go ahead, and what I did myself today, just to refresh, I took the various pages and then I wrote them down. And so you want to go over that. And I had a student contact me, and he told me that he was studying wrong until I guess I helped him. I helped one student. I found out I helped one student one time, and he called me because he wants to go to dental school. And he goes, "You made me stop studying the way I studied, and you made me," I didn't make him do anything. He did it on his own. I told him, "Take your notes and read it over like 5 times." And he goes, "When I started doing that, each time that I went through it, I picked up more information. So read it through, get some understanding the first time. And the next time you go through, you pick up a little bit more. And then the third time you pick up more. And the fourth time more. And the fifth time." So he's applying to dental school. So I guess something works. Okay. So, all right. I'm here. If you have any questions, just get a hold of me. What we want to be doing is working on this material so you get it down. And next week we'll be talking about this object. You know, we'll talk about the eye and ear, we'll talk about special sensation and stuff like that. Okay. So if there's no other questions, I'll leave it to you to start looking over this material. You want to take the quiz as many times as you need to. There'll probably be up to 10. But I'm looking for good grades, and I want you to kind of take it as many times as you need to. Okay. If you have nothing for me or want to say anything, I'll catch you guys next week, and thank you for being in class. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good night.